Imagine for a second, you wake up from surgery. You're in pain, you're vulnerable, and you're just waiting for the doctor to tell you what comes next.
Right, the terrifying moment of waiting for the plan.
Exactly. But when they hand you your treatment plan, you realize something that's honestly quite chilling. The medication they're prescribing isn't actually tailored to your unique biology at all.
It's not based on your genetics or your personal history?
No, not at all. Not even how your body reacted to the surgery. Instead, the treatment is legally dictated by a government algorithm. It's just this statistical average derived from millions of strangers.
Strangers you might have absolutely zero in common with biologically.
Right. And if your doctor tries to change that treatment to actually fit your specific body, they could literally lose their medical license.
It sounds like, the setup for a dystopian sci-fi movie.
It really does.
Yeah.
But the wild reality is this is the hidden mechanics of the modern healthcare system that you navigate every single day.
Which is exactly why we need to unpack this.
Yes, and that's why we're doing this deep dive today. Welcome to you, the listener. We're looking at the intersection of medical law, biology, and, honestly, your fundamental autonomy. We've got a massive stack of sources today.
The scope of the documentation we have is, well, it's pretty staggering.
Let me just lay out the map for you. We're looking at rigorous medical literature, critiquing evidence-based medicine, which we'll call EBM, and the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, or NICE. Plus, we have this dense legal analysis from the law firm Hill Dickinson.
And we aren't just sticking to law and medicine, we're crossing over into philosophy, right?
We have scientific transcripts on the physics of free will, explorations of the ancient Indian concept of dharma, and these profound writings from Dr. Katyali Srivatsa about patient autonomy and the trauma of modern systems.
Okay, before we really dive into the weeds here, I need to make something crystal clear for you, the listener.
Go ahead, set the frame.
The sources we are unpacking today contain some very strong, politically charged, and systemic critiques of government bodies, healthcare systems, and legal frameworks.
Right, they pull no punches.
Exactly. But we are just exploring the claims and the arguments constructed by the authors of these documents. We are not taking sides or endorsing these viewpoints at all.
We are strictly impartial guides here.
We're just decoding these fascinating, sometimes unsettling ideas contained in the source material so you can analyze them for yourself.
Our mission today is to connect these dots, to answer a huge question raised by the texts. Do rulers and governments actually have the right to impose medical mandates that affect life on Earth?
And how does that ancient concept of dharma explain the consequences of doing so?
Right. What happens to your physical body when a system forces you to surrender your free will? To understand that, we have to start with the architecture of evidence-based medicine.
Let's look at the rise of EBM. Because to understand how your free will is even in question, we have to look at the Cohen paper.
Okay, let's unpack this because I have to play devil's advocate here. Evidence-based sounds like, well, a good thing. Who argues against evidence?
It sounds unimpeachable, yeah.
Wasn't medicine kind of the Wild West before the 1990s? Doctors just prescribing whatever based on gut feelings? So it wasn't standardization necessary to save lives?
That was the exact argument that launched EBM. According to Aaron Michael Cohen's paper, the proponents of EBM pushed it as this necessary rescue mission, a new paradigm to save medicine from those variations in practice.
So if I break my leg in New York, I get the same treatment as in London. Makes sense.
It does make sense on the surface. But to achieve that, the authors argue EBM had to adopt a super rigid philosophy. They created a strict hierarchy of evidence.
And what's at the top of that hierarchy?
The randomized controlled trial, the RCT. It's the absolute pinnacle. And just below that are meta-analyses, which are just massive statistical aggregations of RCTs.
Okay, so it's all about large group statistics.
Yeah.
But what got pushed to the bottom? What was sacrificed?
The individual. Clinical experience was totally devalued. Observational studies were dismissed.
Wow, really? Even a doctor's actual experience with patients?
Yeah. The Cohen paper points out a huge philosophical flaw here. EBM assumes scientific observations can be perfectly unbiased, and it demands doctors base decisions on statistical averages of massive trials, rather than their own clinical intuition.
Or, the specific context of the patient sitting right in front of them.
Exactly. Cohen has this great quote. He says, "There is no mean tendency for a single patient. A therapy is beneficial for a person or it is not."
That hits hard. Because you, the listener, you're a complex individual. You aren't a statistical group.
But a massive bureaucracy can't process individuals. It only processes populations. So to turn those EBM statistics into rules, you need a governing body.
Right. And in the UK, that's NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence.
They take the EBM data and turn it into clinical practice guidelines, or CPGs.
But originally, weren't these just guidelines, like just helpful advice for doctors?
They were. But the legal analysis from Hill Dickinson shows a terrifying shift. Case law is slowly transforming these guidelines into mandatory laws. They call it legal creep.
Legal creep. And they highlight that tragic case to illustrate this, right? The Elizabeth Rose case.
Yes, Elizabeth Rose versus Thanet Clinical Commissioning Group. She was a young woman with severe Crohn's disease, facing chemotherapy that would likely leave her infertile.
So she wanted to freeze her eggs. Oocyte cryopreservation.
Exactly. And according to the actual NICE guidelines at the time, she perfectly met the criteria for it. But her local healthcare group, the CCG, refused to fund it.
So she took them to court. And the judge ruled in her favor, right?
Sure.
He forced them to follow the guideline.
He did. Justice Jay ruled that the CCG could not simply choose to ignore NICE guidance. They needed a highly exceptional reason to depart from it.
On the surface, I'd hear that and think, great, the guideline saved her from bureaucracy. Why is this a bad turning point?
Because of the precedent it sets for every doctor, it shifts NICE guidelines from best practices to de facto laws. If you don't follow them, you face severe risk of negligence claims.
Wait, what about the old standard, the Bolam test?
The 1957 Bolam test used to protect doctors. It basically asked if a responsible body of medical men would agree with the doctor's decision. It protected clinical judgment.
So it protected treating the individual. But now that's being overshadowed by strict adherence to NICE.
Completely overshadowed. The Hill Dickinson report warns that failing to follow NICE is increasingly fatal to defending a malpractice claim.
Okay, let me synthesize this. If EBM relies on statistical averages of huge groups, and the law forces doctors to apply this to an individual.
Yeah, follow that logic.
Isn't that like passing a law that says everyone must wear a statistically average size 8 shoe, regardless of their actual foot size?
That is a perfect analogy.
And if a doctor gives you a size 10 because they can see your foot is bigger, they get sued for negligence.
Their hands are legally tied. They have to force your foot into the size 8 shoe.
But if these averages are becoming mandatory laws, we have to ask, how reliable is the data driving the EBM machine? It better be flawless.
Well, that leads us to the cracks in the machine. The sources expose massive flaws in how NICE and EBM operate. It is not objective science.
The biggest example in our stack is that controversy over the 2021 NICE Feet Guideline for Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, or MECFS.
Right. The critique by Trudy Chalder, Simon Wesley, and over 50 international specialists, it completely dismantles the NICE review process.
What exactly happened there? Because they downgraded gold standard treatments, right?
Yeah. For years, the global evidence-backed treatments for CFS were cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and graded exercise therapy, GT.
And these were backed by RCTs, the so-called holy grail of EBM.
Multiple high-quality RCTs. But when NICE updated the guideline, they literally downgraded those robust trials to low or very low quality.
How do you just downgrade a gold standard trial?
By moving the goalposts. They retroactively applied a new definition of the illness, making post-exertional malaise mandatory. Since the old trials didn't use that exact definition, NICE threw them out.
That is incredibly pedantic. So what did they replace the evidence with to claim the exercise therapy was harmful?
This is what shocked the researchers. NICE completely abandoned their own EBM hierarchy. They prioritized qualitative patient surveys to claim GT was harmful.
Wait, the whole point of EBM was to eliminate subjective bias. But they used subjective internet surveys to ban a globally recognized treatment.
Yes, they ignored systematic reviews showing no harm and banned a treatment based on opinion. They even described a cartoonish, rigid version of the therapy that no real clinician uses.
The trap this creates for doctors is absurd. The researchers pointed out that if a CFS patient also has chronic pain, ND highly recommends those therapies for the pain.
But strictly bans it for the CFS. How do you follow that guideline without risking a lawsuit? You can't.
And it gets darker when you look at the financial incentives. The Cosgrove paper on clinical practice guidelines dives into the conflicts of interest.
This is a huge vulnerability. Cosgrove looked at the American Psychiatric Association's depression guidelines. The people writing these rules often have massive financial ties to pharma companies.
They're key opinion leaders, They sit on speakers bureaus for the companies whose drugs they're evaluating.
And unsurprisingly, those APA guidelines aggressively prioritized SSRIs and SNRIs over other interventions, despite known iatrogenic harms.
Iatrogenic meaning the harm caused by the medical treatment itself. So the guidelines push the drugs cause side effects, and the system profits.
Exactly. But perhaps the most chilling part of how EBM values human life is found in the National Council on Disability report.
Oh, the QALYs, quality adjusted life years. This part was genuinely disturbing. How does a QAL even work?
It's an economic metric to determine if a drug is worth paying for. 1 year of perfect health equals 1.0 QALY. Death is 0.
Okay, so if I'm a healthy 30-year-old and need a $50,000 drug to cure an infection and live a healthy year, that's 1.0 QALY.
The system says it's a good investment. But what if you have multiple sclerosis and use a wheelchair?
Right, same infection, same drug needed.
The system views your baseline quality of life as lower, so an extra year for you might only be 0.5 QALYs.
So spending that same $50,000 to save me is mathematically considered less cost-effective.
Yes. The NCD report states this metric puts a discount price tag on disabled lives. It's institutionalized discrimination.
The Alzheimer's example they gave was horrific. In 2005, NICE used the MMSE cognitive test to ration Alzheimer's meds.
And that test was completely invalid for people with pre-existing intellectual disabilities, like Down syndrome.
So because someone with Down syndrome couldn't pass a test designed for neurotypical people, the EBM algorithm said they didn't deserve medication.
Exactly. It's biomedical reductionism at its worst, shrinking human complexity to a single, flawed data point.
Anne Bresson's paper on burnout really highlights how this reductionism traumatizes patients.
She studied people with severe burnout on long-term sick leave. She looked at their lived, subjective reality, not just data.
And what did the EBM system do to them?
It forced them into a box. To get sick leave and treatment, clinicians routinely diagnose these complex patients simply as depressed.
Because the algorithm has a billable pathway for depression and SSRIs.
Right. But the patients said they didn't feel psychiatrically depressed. They felt profoundly drained and alienated from their bodies. The system refused to recognize their reality.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If guidelines are financially biased, scientifically flawed, and actively discriminatory,
And legally enforced on doctors.
doesn't this mean the government is legally mandating physical and mental trauma on the population?
That is the inescapable conclusion of these authors. It's an assault on bodily autonomy that fundamentally alters human psychology.
It strips away our free will, which means we have to pivot here and look at the science of free will, coercion, and obedience.
To understand the physical trauma of obedience, we have to look at the debate on determinism in our sources, like the Startalk and Aperture transcripts.
Determinism basically says we're biological robots, right? Every choice is just genetics and physics playing out in our brains.
Hard determinists argue free will is an illusion, and they use extreme medical examples to prove it, like Charles Whitman, the Texas Tower shooter.
He begged for an autopsy in his notes because he couldn't control his violent impulses, and they found a tumor pressing on his amygdala.
Exactly. Or the case of Domenico Mediello, a teacher who developed pedophilic urges due to a tumor in his orbitofrontal cortex.
When they removed the tumor, the urges stopped. I get the argument, but most of us aren't acting under the influence of a massive brain tumor.
That's true. But Corey Crisimoto's research shows it isn't just internal biology that hijacks our choices, it's external systems. Coercion.
Coercion acting like a tumor on the outside.
Yes. He uses the analogy of a ship captain in a deadly storm. If he throws the cargo overboard to save the crew, we intuitively feel he had no choice. The situation limited his psychological freedom.
So let's map that to the medical system. What happens when the coercive force is a massive bureaucracy backed by legal threats?
When the doctor is told, follow the guideline or lose your license, and the patient is told, take this average treatment or get nothing.
According to the Maya Meditation book, that specific systemic coercion creates measurable physical illness.
Free will is the firewall of the soul. The text explains the nervous system has two modes, autonomy and submission.
Autonomy is I choose. That state produces health, balanced hormones, and cellular regeneration.
But submission is I must obey to survive. And that creates a totally different chemical cascade.
When you're forced into submission by an algorithmic system that ignores you as an individual, your primal body perceives it as a mortal threat.
You flood with cortisol and adrenaline, chronic inflammation sets in. You experience deep emotional numbness to cope.
The quote that stuck with me is, "Your body cannot tell the difference between a real predator and an imagined threat like an unjust medical mandate."
It's profound, and it connects to Machiavelli and Hannah Arendt's banality of evil discussed in the Cyphoria transcript.
How does Machiavelli fit into medical guidelines and cortisol?
Because systems of power demand obedience to survive. Bureaucracies apply evolutionary pressure against critical thinking.
Right, Arndt's idea that evil isn't a monster, it's a bureaucrat just checking boxes.
A doctor follows nice guidelines not out of patient-centered reasoning, but out of fear of litigation. This systemic thoughtlessness is the root of the harm.
Dr. Srivatsa writes extensively about this. He spent 15 years in the NHS. He says this creates doctor-centered care.
It conditions patients to outsource their trust to professionals and synthesized pills instead of listening to their own bodies.
He calls the body's natural intelligence Zeta 9, right?
Yes, Zeta 9. It's the biological capacity to heal, but it needs space, time, and autonomy.
But the system rushes in, overprescribes, and slaps a chronic label on you based on EBM, totally suffocating Zeta 9.
It enslaves the patient to the idea of being sick. Self-sacrifice and forced obedience literally make people sick.
So for you, the listener, if you're forced to surrender your bodily autonomy to an EBM algorithm, your biology registers that as mortal danger.
Stripping away free will acts as a literal biological pathogen.
But if taking away free will causes physical illness, what happens when we view this through a cosmic lens, when rulers play God?
We have to look at the ancient philosophical texts on Dharma and Rajtarma.
Dharma isn't just a religious rulebook or a yoga concept. The texts make that very clear.
Not at all. It comes from the Sanskrit root dhr, meaning to hold or sustain.
If society is a bridge, Dharma isn't the priest blessing it. It's the structural integrity of the steel cables, the physics of gravity.
That's a brilliant analogy. It's the underlying physics of society and the cosmos.
And its opposite is adharma, entropy, action that causes chaos and destruction.
So adharma is the rust degrading the bolts of the bridge. The charity, according to Dharma text, says an adharmic system is destined to crumble.
Because you can't break the physics of society without society collapsing. So how does Rajtarma fit in?
Rajtarma is the specific duty of rulers. In the West, we had the divine right of kings, where the king was the law.
Right, his whims dictated everything.
But under Rajtarma, the king is subject to the law of Dharma. His only legitimacy is prajapalanam, the protection and welfare of the subjects.
So the ultimate argument here is that governments do not have the right to impose laws that arbitrarily control or damage life.
Because they are just custodians of Dharma. When they enforce rigid EBM guidelines that ignore individual biology, they violate Rajtarma.
They are actively mandating adharma, spraying rust on the bridge.
And it isn't just humans who suffer. The herbal medicine text shows how this impacts the natural world.
Oh, this part was wild. Their relentless drive for EBM standardization demands synthesized, chemically converted drugs.
Because you can't patent a complex forest plant, the text mentions barbasco, which contains diosgenin.
The pharmaceutical industry aggressively processes it into steroidal drugs, breaking its natural complexity.
And the result? Those synthesized drugs produce serious long-term side effects that the natural plant didn't.
And the animal testing for this EBM data is horrific. They isolate compounds from a plant called Manuka and inject massive doses into animals.
Just to establish safety protocols, it induces violent tremors, hypothermia, and fatal respiratory paralysis in the animals.
The industrial medical complex literally inflicts trauma on plants and animals just to generate statistical data points.
It completely disrupts the dharmic balance of all life on Earth.
Wait, so if an adharmic system creates its own destruction, is the current collapse of our global healthcare systems actually a physical manifestation of adharma?
According to this framework, absolutely. It is collapsing under the weight of its own entropy because it violently violates the natural order.
So if the system is rusting away and participating in it causes biological harm, how do we protect ourselves? What is the antidote?
The sources point to a profound shift away from EBM toward person-centered healthcare, or PCH, detailed by Mercuri and Bolt.
PCH, putting the human being back in the center.
Exactly, reintegrating the patient's values and dignity. The papers say we must reject the neo-Humean notion of causation.
Right, David Hume. Treating the complex human body like a simple physics experiment. A causes B.
It ignores the patient's context, diet, stress, genetics, and treats them as interchangeable data points. PCH rejects that.
But how do you practice PCH when the legal system is rigged against it? This is where Dr. Srivatsa's Prima kiosk comes in.
Yes, the AI triage system powered by Dr. Maya AI. It's a physical kiosk, like a modern phone booth.
You walk in, it takes your vitals with medical-grade sensors, and the AI gives you a clinically reasoned, color-coded assessment.
Blue for immediate isolation, red for an ambulance, green for home rest, and yellow for mild issues.
And it restores Dharma because it doesn't legally dictate treatment. It empowers you with knowledge before you enter the coercive machine.
It acts as a kiosk guardian, even employing retired healthcare workers for empathy. Crucially, it combats antimicrobial resistance, or AMR.
Right, because it stops the panic-driven urge to demand antibiotics for every sniffle, which doctors overprescribe out of fear of litigation.
By telling a patient they are green, it restores that Z to 9 space. It gives the body time and autonomy to heal without reflexive medicalization.
But what if the government continues to overreach and mandate adharmic treatments? What is the final recourse?
The Western Theories of Justice text brings in John Rawls. He states that if laws violate civil liberties, citizens have a moral obligation to engage in civil disobedience.
Reclaiming your free will isn't just about health, it's an act of restoring Dharma.
By refusing to be an obedient participant in a flawed EBM machine, you push back against the banality of evil.
If the system demands submission, your ultimate act of healing is reclaiming your right to choose.
Exactly.
Let's do a quick recap. We explored how statistical averages in EBM were weaponized into legal mandates by bodies like NICE.
We saw how this rigid enforcement ignores the individual and devalues the disabled through metrics like QALYs.
It inflicts trauma on the natural world and strips away our biological and psychological free will, flooding us with cortisol.
And through the lens of Raj Dharma, we see that rulers imposing these laws are acting against the cosmic order, mandating adharma.
If we connect this to the bigger picture,
We spend trillions searching for chemical cures. But if the loss of free will literally causes the body to attack itself, could the most potent medicine be the radical courage to disobey an unjust system?
that is something to truly mull over. Reclaiming your sovereignty might be the ultimate cure. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We will see you next time.